Edgar Allan Poe left Richmond, Virginia on September 27th of 1849, bound via steamship for Baltimore, where he was to catch a train north to Philadelphia and then on to New York City. He never arrived at his final destination. Found shabbily dressed and incoherent in a Baltimore gutter on October 3rd, he was taken to the city's Washington College Hospital, where he died, still delirious, on October 7th. Nothing whatsoever was known of his activities in the period from his boarding of the boat in Richmond until his discovery nearly a week later. Those 6 missing days have remained one of the most intriguing of all the unsolved mysteries in literary history. In September of 2005, a musty leather folio was located at the bottom of a misplaced carton stacked in the archives of the University of Iowa's Poe collection. This folio, misplaced among the papers of noted Poe scholar Thomas Mabbutt, contained several handwritten journals, signed and dated by Mr. Rufus Wilmot Griswold, 1815-1857, Poe's literary executor. These are the contents of those journals, a complete telling of the facts related to the last lost week in the life and death of Edgar Allan Poe. Now, that was true up to the point of the discovery of the folio of papers. Except that I discovered them, of course. There is actually a great Poe collection at the University of Iowa, and Thomas Mabbutt was a great Poe scholar. So there is stuff there if you want to go and put on your white gloves and go through it. But these are the journals of Rufus Wilmot Griswold, who was indeed Poe's literary executor, and upon Poe's death published a obituary in a New York paper saying that Edgar Allan Poe has recently died. There are few that will mourn his passing. It was a very negative, awful obituary, excoriating him for his many sins of excess and he had many bad habits, let's say. He was known to drink a little bit, do whatever drugs were available, and suffer from the diseases of the era, such as the French disease, or so it was rumored. The French disease being syphilis, if you were English. If you were French, it was called the English disease. But Poe, Griswold took over Poe's literary estate and ran it and swindled his widow out of a lot of money. But he was also, in effect, while Poe was alive, Poe's literary agent. It's a curious, curious relationship. And he is also, as I said, a real figure in history. And so these are his journals. This is, I'll read from the beginning of the book, chapter 1. It's entitled A Note for the Reader. And it just is a foreknown. Writing this book, I wanted to do 2 things. I'm a great lover of old books. And Poe's style being heavily Gothic, as you well know, if I would try to write in that style, no one would read it, or it would be very difficult to read if I did the Castle of Otranto style Gothic. But I wanted it to be very Gothic and have the feel of the era. So I wrote it in a Gothic style, pulling back, hopefully enough so that it still had a little bit of modern connection that you can, for one thing, the words, the vocabulary is different over the eras, and I also stole, or as Salvador Dali would say, borrowed, a few of Poe's passages, as many of his short stories and his poems are referenced or lived out in the space of this book, which covers that last week. Chapter 1, July 12, 1857, a note to the reader. There are certain areas of study that tempt our intellects, but which are too entirely spiritually dangerous for the wise man to pursue. Thus, I have kept this story as the closest of secrets. Only now, as my death approaches, do I surrender this manuscript into other hands, scholarly hands, trusting that care will be taken to shield it from the unprepared eye. My soul's course has been long set, and I pray God will forgive me for loosing this truth on any unsuspecting soul. I ask only that those who examine my words understand that all the depravity, horror, and perversity contained in this telling are meant as a caution and a warning. If there is terror and damnation, let it be known that the evil contained here is always to be judged as, in essence, a dark reflection of divine light. It was neither my intention nor my desire to be witness to the black events of that week in Baltimore. Indeed, none are even aware of my presence during the disturbing series of calamities that occurred that early autumn. My friend's condition compelled me to keep all these matters confidential. As a friend, I have kept to this course until now. I pray he will forgive me this need, for it is just that. As I feel death approach, I am compelled to let loose this weight that has become an anchor chained to my immortal spirit. I must break those links so that I am free of my grievous failures and my mortal sins. This is the truth of the burdensome decision that I made that terrible day with the smell of burnt flesh in my nose. I pledged myself to keep all of these tragic events beyond the reach of coarse intellects. I swore I would never reveal this chronicle of a damned society, a fallen world, a waking nightmare that even now, years later, I scarce believe happened in reality. So, I implore your forgiveness for the crude, even shocking nature of this narrative. Stop now if your nature is delicate or your spiritual condition is unsteady. The dead and the undead, the murdered and the dismembered, the smell of opium, the stench of alcohol, all of these degradations and hellish tragedies that plague the underbelly of our civilization await you. I will endeavor to relate the case dispassionately. If I lose sight of the ultimate order of God's creation and his unknown purposes, know that I too was scarred by these occurrences. Murder echoes through a man's life. I am, in the end, as base as any man and prone to self-justifications. Finally, I beg for the blessing of my poor friend who has passed from this plane into eternity. I undertook to deflect all from the nature of these his final days. I marked him with one sin in order to distract those who would destroy his legacy should they discover the true nature of the circumstances that surrounded his death. Now, with his immortality assured and my decline into obscurity ordained, I remove these pages from the safe where I've kept them these last 8 years. I consign them to you and your interested associates. Judge for yourself if he is to be condemned or celebrated. Weigh the factors of the case and decide. This is the truth of it, the disturbing events of that week in Baltimore and the death of my friend, Edgar Allan Poe, as told by his final companion, his literary executor, his failed assassin, myself. Signed, Rufus W. Griswold. So that's our entry into what is about to happen, taking Griswold's somewhat libelous obituary as a base. I decided that he was indeed Poe's true friend. Poe is in this story, and the reason for the title, if you're familiar with Poe, he is the imp of perversion. It's one of his short stories, one of his particularly thick and hard to read short stories. But the essence of the imp of perversion, which has become a concept in psychology, is, have you ever stood on a really tall place, a cliff or a very tall building, and you're standing on the edge? What is that you feel? Is it a fear of falling, or is it a fear of jumping? That's the imp of the perverse. The imp of the perverse is we do not do something in spite of knowing it is evil. We do it precisely because we know it is. And this imp that lives in all humans. So that's the origin of the title, Imp. Now, chapter 2, I'm just going to give, I can't go too far into this book because there are some giveaways here, and The following letter was found loosely inserted into Griswold's portfolio. It is handwritten and is what is accredited experts verify surely the hand of Edgar Allan Poe. The conservator has been unable to ascertain the exact date. The note was posted as a result of the condition of the document. Written on inexpensive rag paper, the letter has numerous folds and creases, perhaps as a result of being crumpled by a human hand and tossed aside. There are light brown stains and discolorations of indeterminate origin. In addition, one corner of the sheet is burnt, as if the recipient or other parties unknown began to burn the missive. Richmond, Virginia, September 1849. Dear Griswold, I have given this note to Mr. L., who has pledged to see that it reaches you with dispatch. Some disturbing events have occurred that I feel require your personal attention. Having made some recent discoveries, which I think would be unwise to elaborate on in an uncertain post, I propose that we meet in a week's time at Baltimore. I must impress upon you with all urgency that these latest occurrences, which have placed my life in danger, and these newly uncovered facts which threaten your reputation, make such a rendezvous absolutely imperative. In addition, I have ascertained the whereabouts of a certain preacher and hope to gather more information within the next few hours. Ever in mind of the disdain you have for me personally and the unpleasant prospect such a journey may be to your sensibilities, I must insist that you do not dismiss my request without consideration. I shall arrive in Maryland on the 28th, or such at this date is my intention. Do not fail me, for in God's name I know, sir, I know what the sepulchre contained. Truly yours, Edgar A. Poe. The letter was the first thing I wrote in the novel before I was even sure what was going to happen with Griswold and who he was exactly. As you know, Poe was obsessed with the premature burial. It became one of his finest stories, actually. And in the era, it was not uncommon to buy, when you bought a coffin, there was one coffin designed with a little string that would lead up to a bell on the headstone so that you could ring it. And there were other devices that would, it was quite a fear, a terrible fear. And the practices of people who were placed in sepulchres was not unusual. I think Abraham Lincoln did it with his son Todd. After the burial, after the funeral, 2 or 3 days after, to go into the sepulcher and spend the night with the body. And it was highly Gothic. It was very Gothic. So I kind of had that in mind, and then the stories started percolating as who's blackmailing who for what, and frankly, the story involved zombies, which was something else, life after death and voodoo. It's also, and I don't know if I'll get to this portion of the book, but one of the real heroes of the book is a character named Jupiter. If you've read Poe, you may have read The Gold Bug, which is one of his famous puzzle stories. It's a treasure hunt on an island, and there are various clues, and I actually use a matrix clue in here, much like Gold Bug did. But during that story, it must be remembered that Edgar Allan Poe was a Southerner and a virulent racist, even by standards of the day. And in the story, The Gold Bug, there is a black character named Jupiter, a slave, and he is mercilessly portrayed with about every stereotype you can. So in this story, Jupiter is quite the opposite. This is Jupiter's revenge on Poe as well, my way of giving Jupiter some time to talk back to Poe. And, well, you'll have to read the book. But